Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're journeying to Eastern Africa's jewel, Kenya.
Hmm.
You might know it for its, well, incredible wildlife, maybe the Great Rift Valley.
Iconic landscapes, definitely.
But underneath all that, there's this really complex, vibrant history. We're talking ancient human origins, cultural mixing, the deep impact of colonialism.
It's in that ongoing journey, towards self-determination, stability. It's quite a story.
It really is.
So our mission here with this deep dive is to take all these sources you've gathered, academic stuff, economic reports, the lot, and kind of pull out the most important bit.
The nuggets of knowledge, yeah.
Exactly. The surprising facts, too. We want to give you a shortcut to really getting Kenya, not just the what happened, but the why it matters.
And how that past is still, well, very much alive in the present.
Precisely.
And it's quite a path we'll take. We're starting way back. Dawn of human history in East Africa.
And then migrations, the Swahili coast culture.
Right. Colonialism, of course, the fight for independence, and then bringing it up to modern Kenya, the economy, society, politics.
It's a lot to unpack.
Definitely. So let's get into it.
Okay, so one of the first things that really jumps out from the sources is just how fundamental Kenya's geography is.
Right. You've got borders with Tanzania, Uganda, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and the Indian Ocean. Huge diversity.
And right through the middle, the Great Rift Valley, that massive geological feature.
It's not just visually stunning, is it? The sources talk about its unique geology, the wildlife, but also that fertile volcanic soil.
Which fostered immense cultural diversity. It acted almost like a crucible.
And it's interesting how the geography, the mountains, swamps, they kind of channeled movement, didn't they?
Yeah, transportation was often limited to these narrow corridors.
Which led to, kind of paradoxically, more distinct cultural pockets.
That's what the sources suggest. Over 30 distinct tribes, maybe more than 300 separate languages.
Wow, so you could have, say, a Kikuyu speaker, part of the Bantu family.
Finding it really hard to communicate with someone from the Luo tribe who speak a Nilotic language.
It just shows the sheer variety.
And thinking bigger picture, East Africa. Well, it's the cradle of humanity, isn't it?
Yeah, findings near Lake Victoria go back over 2 million years. Early campsites, tools.
Food bonfires, yeah. Near Kajiado, Lake Turkana. It puts Kenya right at the start of the human story.
So after those very ancient beginnings, things start moving. Around 2,500 years ago, we see these major migration waves into Kenya.
Right. First, the Nilotics. They came in between, say, 2000 BC and 500 AD, mainly pastoralists settling mostly in the west.
Okay.
Then you get the Cushitic speakers, roughly 200 to 500 AD, settling up in the northeast.
And the third wave?
The Bantu migrants. This was maybe the biggest wave numerically and arguably had a huge impact. They arrived in waves, maybe 500 to 1500 AD.
Often driven by climate change, the sources say?
Seems likely, yeah. And they weren't just moving, they were cultivators, iron workers.
This is part of that bigger Bantu expansion from West Africa, right? Starting maybe 3,000 years ago.
Exactly. And they brought agriculture, metallurgy, whole new ways of organizing society to East Africa. It was transformative.
But it wasn't smooth sailing necessarily.
No, definitely not. There was intense competition for the best land, for water, for grazing pasture.
So communities ended up quite scattered, having to defend their own areas.
Pretty much. And this early pre-colonial period is really where we start to see the outlines of Kenya's current ethnic makeup taking shape.
And these weren't just random groups. They were organized societies.
Absolutely. Clans, tribes. They had defined territories, their own governments, chiefs, councils of elders. They respected boundaries.
And had their own spiritual beliefs as supreme being.
Right. And social life was governed by really well-defined cultures. Family systems, inheritance rules, art, marriage customs, even environmental protection, interestingly.
Wow. And the social structure.
Typically 3 main classes: elders, warriors, and then women and children, each with, their expected roles.
And going back to the Bantu, the word itself just means human beings.
That's right. And today, major Bantu-speaking groups include the Kikuyu, Kamba, Meru, Embu, Kisi, mostly central and western Kenya.
And the Luya Ligisu in the Rift Valley.
Yeah. And this is crucial. This migration history isn't just academic.
No.
The sources argue it catalyzed competition and social stratification for land and livestock that is at the core of contemporary violence and ethnic divisions.
So those ancient movements still echo today. A historical fault line, really.
Absolutely. It's a theme we'll keep seeing.
Okay, so we've looked inland at the deep origins. But Kenya's story also has this major coastal dimension, the Swahili coast.
Right, this incredible 3,000-kilometer stretch down from Somalia to Mozambique, the people of the sea.
And it's a prime example of what the sources call a hybrid culture.
Yeah, forged from interaction, indigenous people meeting foreign influences, especially traders.
And the language itself, Swahili, reflects that.
Totally. It emerged from Bantu dialects mixing with Arabic from the traders.
And that trade also brought Islam to the coast.
It did. And it wasn't just about religion. It changed everything. It gave rulers legitimacy, created new trade networks, influenced art styles.
Their connection to the sea gave them a real edge, didn't it?
For centuries, yeah. In local politics, trade. They became known as this cultured people with sophisticated towns.
Like Kilwa, Mombasa, Lamu, Zanzibar, those famous stone towns built from coral rag.
Impressive structures, even today.
So why is this Swahili Coast chapter so important for understanding Kenya?
Well, I think it shows just how connected East Africa was to the wider world, long before Europeans arrived.
Right, it counters that old idea of an isolated continent.
Exactly. These were complex societies driven by trade, by cultural exchange. A unique identity was forged there.
Okay, now we need to shift gears into a much darker period, what the sources call the colonial shadow.
Britain directly colonized Kenya in 1895, a crown colony, and right from the start, that stark division.
The two opposing policies, for the accursed of black and favored white man. That phrasing is chilling.
It is. And you had the 1890 treaty, where Britain, Germany, Portugal basically carved things up.
But the real catalyst for devastation, according to the sources, was the railway.
The railway to Uganda, starting in 1896. It wasn't just about transport, it opened the door.
To white settlement and widespread racial discrimination.
And then came the scramble for land, the 1902 Crown Lands Ordinance. That was the legal tool.
Millions of acres taken for the White Highlands.
And this was directly tied to exploiting cheap or even free labor for the new cash economy.
While completely undermining traditional livelihoods, losing ancestral land. That's losing identity.
Absolutely fundamental, and it was progressive, this land appropriation, often with zero compensation.
People were pushed off their land, and then these reserves were created.
Designed to be miserable, as one source puts it, basically reservoirs of cheap labor.
It makes Kenya stand out, even within the British Empire.
Yeah, it's described as an ugly blot, very different from, say, Uganda or Nigeria, where they were actually fostering some native administration, thinking about self-government eventually.
Kenya was more like Rhodesia. White settlement, deep discrimination.
Exactly. Laws preventing Africans from owning the best land, fertile areas, mining zones, leaving them with the arid, rocky bits.
And the settlers themselves, described as young but aggressive, arrogant, and hungry for land.
A powerful combination. And crucially, the sources emphasize that the colonists manipulated existing ethnic tensions.
Right, manipulated until independence, enduring with cataclysmic eruptions up to the present. That legacy of division is so persistent.
Which leads us directly into the Mau Mau Uprising.
And it's key to understand this wasn't just a reaction to colonialism. It had deeper roots.
Deep roots in Kikuyu history prior to European invasion, yeah. But the core drive was clear: land and freedom.
Mau itself often translates to the cry for land.
It represented this emerging revolutionary nationalism.
But it wasn't simple. It was complex, multifaceted.
Definitely. It grew out of this widespread discontent, particularly among the Kikuyu, who were the largest group.
But not only Kikuyu, right?
No, that's important. Meru, Embu, Maasai people were involved. Even some European Quakers, followers of Odinga. They were sympathizers, financiers.
So Mau Mau's may be an imperfect label, as the sources say.
Yeah, it doesn't capture the full picture.
And the colonial response, brutal.
Utterly. State of emergency declared, October 20th, 1952, and then this policy called the pipeline.
Chilling name.
It involved forcibly confining maybe 70% of the Kikuyu population, about 1 million people, in concentration camps.
The conditions, forced labor, torture, sexual violence, systematic beatings, just horrific.
And women were deeply involved in the movement, oathing, nationalist activities, and they suffered massively, targeted by colonial racism.
The force used. NATO weapons, bombing villages, using napalm on the mountains.
It shows the ruthlessness, total war, really.
Now, where does Jomo Kenyatta fit in here? He later became president, but his path was different.
He pursued constitutional change, yeah. But he was actually imprisoned during the Mau Mau period, from 1953. at committee.
His legacy is complex then, balancing those promises of freedom with, well, elite control later on.
Very much so. And while Mau Mau was defeated militarily,
Who wasn't silenced.
not at all. It left this legacy of trauma, unresolved land issues, which some sources say foreshadowed problems later, post-colonial despotism.
Okay, so after all that turmoil in the 40s and 50s, British policy starts to shift.
Yeah, post-WWII pressures were building, calls to extend voting rights, acknowledge African voices. It became harder to ignore. This paved the road to independence.
Kenyatta, even in prison, was a powerful symbol.
Absolutely. Then in 1960, KNANU, the Kenya Land African National Union, was formed.
And by 61, African majority rule in the legislature. A big step.
A very big step. And then the key dates. June 1st, 1963, Kenyatta, now prime minister, announces independence is coming in 64.
But the official proclamation was July 63.
It's July 25th, yeah. New constitution in August. And then finally, official independence, December 12th, 1963.
Must have been an incredible moment. But the sources suggest the reality afterwards was complicated.
Yeah. Huge celebrations, obviously, but also this feeling among some that Kenyatta had betrayed the freedom fighters.
Because land wasn't redistributed equally, old privileges remained.
That was a major grievance, yes. The promises of the struggle didn't fully materialize for everyone.
And since independence, Kenya's had 3 presidents leading the way.
Right. Kenyatta first, for about 2 decades, the Kenyatta era.
Then Daniel Arap Moi, who kept the one-party system going for a while.
Until Mwai Kibaki, who restored multi-party democracy. And his time saw some real improvements in healthcare and education.
Okay, let's bring it up to Kenya today. Still this mosaic of progress and challenges. Ethnic identity seems central to politics.
It really is. The sources talk about tribal affiliations and sympathies permeating the whole landscape. Politics often revolves around those tensions, those historical injustices we talked about.
And the sheer number of political parties, from 10 in 92 to 160 by 2008. Wow.
And the concern is they often become these elaborate ethnic alliances.
Yeah.
Leading to an ethnicization of politics.
But there's a nuance there too, right?
Yes, very important. One source argues strongly, don't just blame tribalism. Political parties aren't inherently tribal. They often reflect competition between elites, particularly over land.
And ethnic identities aren't fixed, they can be mobilized.
Exactly. It's more complex than just saying it's tribalism.
Okay, economically, agriculture is still the mainstay.
Yeah, about a quarter of GDP, employs maybe 3/4 of the workforce, mostly rain-fed. Tea, horticulture, coffee are the big cash crops.
But it's strange. Despite having good land and water, there's still food insecurity. Kenya imports maize and wheat now.
It is a paradox, yeah. Lots of potential, but challenges remain. Tourism, though, that's a big success story.
A leading destination in Africa, high growth rate.
Driven by everything, the wildlife, beaches, Mount Kenya, the people. Nairobi is seen as the gateway to East Africa.
Industrial growth has been slower.
Slow industrialization is the term used. Manufacturing is only about 10% of GDP.
And the constraints, poor policy regime, lack of stability, things that deter investment.
That seems to be the assessment, yeah.
Socially, what about changes? Education reforms.
Ongoing efforts there, improving quality, curriculum, access. But implementation is tough.
Healthcare has seen big strides since independence, though. Modern medicine.
Definitely. Things like free ARVs for HIV, free care for under 5s, free mosquito nets, those make a real difference.
But still challenges. Underfunded programs like TB control, road safety, access to private care.
Yeah, those issues persist. It's an ongoing process.
Now, recent history, the 2007-2008 post-election violence looms large.
A really dark period, those disputed election results. Kibaki declared winner over Odinga by a tiny margin.
Sparked just terrible violence. Revenge attacks, riots, looting, killings. Over 1,000 deaths.
And it shifted, didn't it? From political violence to just social violence, criminal gangs getting involved.
Often with police complicity, the sources chillingly note.
That whole crisis did create a huge public demand for constitutional reforms, though.
But the full impact of those is still playing out.
Still unfolding, yeah.
Globally, though, Kenya plays a significant role.
Oh, absolutely. Sound foreign policy, good international relations, Nairobi as a diplomatic hub hosting UN environment, other bodies.
And active in regional groups, IGAD, AU, EAC, COMESA. Peacekeeping, too, in South Sudan, Somalia.
There's that interesting tension mentioned, though, balancing regional cooperation with dealing with domestic issues for international legitimacy.
A balancing act many countries face.
For sure.
And finally, we have to touch on the cultural heritage, just immense diversity.
Stemming from all those different ethnic communities. Yeah, tangible, intangible. Oral traditions, indigenous knowledge, norms, art, crafts, food, dress, language.
Oral literature sounds incredibly rich, folk tales, proverbs.
Very much so. And traditional practices are still alive alongside modern changes, like gender roles evolving with women in business, owning land, forming saving groups.
That's fascinating. And written literature is relatively recent, since 63.
Mostly, yeah. Often in English or French for wider audiences, but also in local languages and still heavily influenced by those oral traditions.
So, wrapping this deep dive up, we've covered a huge amount of ground. From the earliest humans, migrations shaping the ethnic map,
The impact of colonialism, that resilient fight for independence.
and exploring how things like land and ethnicity are still so intertwined with politics and the economy today. Progress, but real challenges too.
Kenya really does seem like a land of contradictions. Hope and fear, equality and injustice.
Exploitation and prosperity side by side.
But what also comes through is the resilience of the people. That ability to overcome doubts and despair with hard work and patience. Striving for stability, democracy, freedom.
Was a final thought from the sources that stability and progress really depend on truthfully handling past injustices and the intrusion of bad government.
Yeah. Which leaves us with a big question for you, the listener, to think about. How does a nation like Kenya, with such a complex, often painful history, truly reconcile that past?
How do you forge a more unified, equitable future out of all that? And what role do things like constitutional reform, political change actually play in that journey?
Something to definitely mull over.